awake now. Thank you, Emily, for stepping in. Appreciate that. If you ask most people inside or outside of the church what Christianity is meant to look like at its best, they'll probably all give you pretty much the same answer. Love. Not programs, not power, not even giftedness, but love. Yet if we're honest, the church has often been known for many things other than love. Strong opinions, maybe some impressive abilities, some deep knowledge, maybe even sometimes spiritual showmanship. And that was true for the Corinthian church in particular. So the Corinthian church, they weren't lacking in gifts. In fact, they were overflowing with them. But they were deeply lacking in love. And so Paul writes what is perhaps the most famous chapter in the Bible, as chapters go. It's pretty close. And he does it not to define love in the abstract, but to correct a church that had confused spirituality with impressiveness. Because here's an uncomfortable truth. You can be gifted and still be spiritually immature. You can be impressive and still be empty. You can do great things and still be nothing. And the difference is love. And so he does start with those words. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have a prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned but have not love, I gain nothing. So Paul begins this chapter with a series of escalating examples, moving from spectacular to sacrificial, and in every case, he says the same thing. Without love, it counts for nothing. If I speak in tongues, if I have prophetic powers or knowledge or faith, if I give away everything I have, even my body, without love, it's just noise. There's nothing. There's no gain. You see, the Corinthians prized the gift of tongues. They saw it as the pinnacle of spirituality. You were the most amazing Christian if you could speak in tongues. And so Paul started right there. Even if you could speak not only human languages, but the very languages of angels, without love, you're just a noisy gong. You know, in the pagan temples of Corinth, gongs and cymbals were used to create loud and impressive noise. It was part of the pagan worship. But yet, they communicated nothing of substance. And Paul is saying that that's what giftedness without love sounds like to God. Loud but empty. You know, love is more important than the most important spiritual gifts. And some of the Corinthian Christians may not have possessed any of the gifts that we mentioned last week from chapter 12, but all of them could practice love. And clearly all of them needed to practice love more. And so Paul speaks of prophecy, God speaking God's truth and knowledge, the deep theological understanding and faith, so strong it can remove mountains, but yet he says even then, as these escalating examples, without love, he says, I am nothing. Not I am less effective, not I am missing something, I am nothing. It's pretty confronting, isn't it? And then he goes further into sacrifice. You can give everything away. You can suffer for others. You can even die for a cause and still not be motivated by love. And that's sobering because It means even outwardly Christian actions are not necessarily loving actions. Now think of two people serving in the same ministry. Both are generous with their time. Both sacrifice energy and comfort. But one does it to be seen, to be needed, or to make them feel significant. The other, though, does it quietly for the good of others and the glory of God. On the outside, both look almost identical. But spiritually, those two people are worlds apart. The difference is love. Now, God has placed his love within us by the indwelling Spirit, and it's that love that should overflow to God and others. And here's a great thing. We don't have to produce it. We don't have to produce love. I think that's very freeing. We don't have to produce it because by God's grace, we just need to cooperate with God by doing his will with his help, and the Spirit will produce it. Because what is it? A fruit of the Spirit. It's not a manufacture of the Spirit. It's not a manufacture of our will. It's a fruit of the Spirit. And I believe that love is, as a great spiritual gift, the greatest in fact, and not just a spiritual grace and a fruit of the Spirit, because God gives us the ability to demonstrate love. And the most lavish exercise of spiritual gifts cannot compensate for a lack of love. And Paul's not contrasting gifts and love as if we're to choose one or the other, right? He's saying love is what gives every gift its value. Love is to Christian service what fuel is to a car, right? Without it, nothing moves the way it should. We are pretty aware of the need of diesel and petrol, and every time we've been filling up recently, it's like, ouch, isn't it? But without our vehicles, we wouldn't be able to do life normally to what we have been used to. Without that fuel, we wouldn't be able to get where we need to go. And Paul's saying pretty much that's like love for us, for our spiritual gifts. It also exposes a deeper issue. What does it really mean to be a Christian, to be, I guess in that context, spiritual? See, for the Corinthians, it meant impressive gifts. Tongues for them, right? And then you had knowledge, displays of power, it's all the other gifts. But for Paul, it's being shaped by the Holy Spirit into the likeness of Christ. And the clearest evidence of that is not giftedness, but love. Next week I want to delve more fully into tongues because we need to for chapter 14. But today we're going to stay on track a little bit closer. Paul mentions prophecy as a higher gift than speaking tongues, but still inferior to love. Understanding the truth without having love is as useless as, feathers on a fish. Yep, great. Yep. The common one came to mind, but I didn't really want to use that. You see, simple possession of spiritual gifts is not the sign of the Spirit. Loving behaviour is. Even if you had faith great enough to remove mountains, right, that's not as important as love. A mountain, right, a universal symbol of something immovable, of course it's a metaphor. If we don't have love, it doesn't matter how much faith we have. Even what passed for self-sacrifice for the less fortunate is not the same as real love. It is inferior to it. Yes, we might help someone else out, but there's no benefit to us as the giver if we don't have love. And even Paul's personal sufferings for the salvation of others were worthless without love. See, we can do something very loving looking. We do all manner of things for all manner of reasons that are not love. And if our motives are not love, then in the sight of God, it is valueless. No divine reward. You know, as Galatians remind us, the fruit of the Spirit is love. Everything else flows from that. You know, gifts may attract attention, but love reveals transformation. So we don't ask, what are my gifts? First we ask, is my life marked by love? When we're in ministry, you know, we're not trying to be impressive or even genuinely helpful to others. We're trying to ask, is my service to Jesus marked by love? You know, and in our church, do people experience us as loving or as just capable? Because without love, even the best things we do ultimately amount to nothing. The fruit of the Spirit is found in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22-23, the chief of which is love. And it's a more obvious demonstration of the Spirit's presence in our life and his control over our lives than the other gifts of the Spirit. And if 1 Corinthians 13 tells us love is greater than gifts, Galatians 5 tells us love is the clearest evidence that the Spirit is actually shaping a person from the inside out. Gifts can be impressive, love is transformative. Gifts can draw attention to a person, love draws attention to Christ. And in Galatians 5, Paul begins with love because love is the character of God himself, and the Spirit conforms believers to God's nature. God is love, and when the Spirit fills a life, he doesn't merely produce religious activity, he produces the likeness of Christ. That is why love is not just one virtue among many, but the atmosphere in which all the others live. Joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are all different faces of love in action. And a useful way to say it is this: love is the root, and all the other graces are its fruiting branches. You do not get true peace without love, because love stops us from needing to control everyone else. You do not get true patience without love, because love is willing to wait for others to grow. You do not get true kindness without love, because kindness is love moving towards someone in practical ways. And that is where the contrast with tongues becomes so important. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul insists that even if someone could speak with extraordinary spiritual speech, without love, that speech is only noise. In other words, tongues may sound impressive, but love is what proves spiritual maturity. The Corinthians were fascinated by outward displays, but Paul keeps pressing us to go deeper. What kind of character is being formed by the Spirit? See, love builds a church because love looks like Jesus. And the strongest proof of the Spirit's presence is not ecstatic utterance, but Christ-like character. See, love is not vague sentiment, and it is not merely affectionate feeling. It is Spirit-enabled self-giving that chooses the good of others. It is the kind of love that keeps showing up, keeps forgiving, keeps serving, and keeps seeking reconciliation. That is why love is so best demonstrated by being filled with the Spirit. It is visible in ordinary life. See, the Spirit does not merely give gifts to make us impressive. He produces love to make us like Christ. So as a church, as people who are followers of Jesus, if we want our church to be fully alive in the Spirit, then we shouldn't be asking, are people dramatic or dazzling, but where are they loving? See, love is the best fruit because it most clearly reveals the Spirit's work, most closely reflects the character of God, and most powerfully contrasts with the self-focused spirituality that Paul confronted in Corinth. We then have the character of love. That it's patient and kind, doesn't envy or boast, isn't arrogant or rude, doesn't insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful, doesn't rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. So if that first section tells us that love is necessary, this shows us what love actually looks like. And Paul doesn't define love in an abstract way. He describes it in action. And it's really deeply practical, relational, and observable. It's been said that this passage is like light through a prism. One beam goes in, and a spectrum of colours comes out. See, love, when examined, reveals many facets. It is patient and kind. Patience is love's response under pressure. Kindness is love's initiative in action. Think of how God treats us. Patient with our slowness, kind in his pursuit of us. That is the shape of love. And I'm glad that Paul starts with those two positives, because then he goes into this section of negatives, right? What love does not do. And they are very behaviours that the Corinthians were displaying. Love does not envy, it does not boast, it is not arrogant or rude, it does not insist on its own way. In other words, love is not self-centered. Love does not deal with other people in a way that injures their dignity. It does not insist on having its own way, nor does it put its own interests before the needs of others. It's not irritable or touchy, but it absorbs offences, insults, and inconveniences for the sake of the welfare of others. I almost feel like I need to say that again, but I think we'll be right. It doesn't demand its preferences. It doesn't elevate itself above others. It doesn't diminish others to elevate self. It's not irritable or resentful. That phrase, resentful, carries the idea of keeping a record of wrongs. Love does not keep score. It doesn't keep an account of a wrong suffered with a view to taking revenge. Warren Wiersbe tells of a man who kept a literal notebook of every wrong done against him. What sort of a man do you reckon he was? He was deeply miserable. Surprise, surprise. Who would have thunk it? That's what resentment does. It chains us to past hurts. Love, by contrast, chooses to release. One of the great arts in life is learning what to forget. Love doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. It doesn't delight in others' failures. It does not feed on gossip. It does not quietly enjoy when someone else falls. But it rejoices in the truth. What is right, what is good, and aligned with the gospel. And then Paul finishes with 4 powerful statements. He says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now, this doesn't mean love is naive. It means love is resilient and generous in how it interprets others. See, love covers unworthy things rather than bringing them to the light and magnifying them. Love is hopeful that those who have failed will not fail again, rather than concluding that their failure is inevitable. It's always eager to believe the best, and it puts the most favourable outcome in view. You know, this passage is used a lot at weddings, and rightly so. I think that's because people who have been married, who have seen how much work it takes in marriage to consistently love the one you have chosen to marry, I think it's because they've seen that they want to encourage people when they're starting out. See, men, our wives, and ladies, our husbands, are never our enemies. We should never think or assume the worst about them, but always give them the benefit of the doubt. For example, if they say something and we could take that in two ways, and one would offend or annoy us or cause us a fight, love means we assume they meant the other one. We think the best of their intentions. We take their words and actions in the most positive way and assume they want the best for us as we do for them. How many times do you think those little arguments could have been avoided if instead we had have jumped to the best conclusion first rather than the worst? Do you think we could have interpreted what they said in the most favourable light rather than the most unfavourable light? Our husbands, our wives, we are not enemies. See, love is ever ready to make excuses for others. It throws a kindly mantle over all of their faults. It doesn't allow itself to become overwhelmed, but it perseveres steadfastly through difficult trials. See, love gives the benefit of the doubt. Love hopes for growth. Love perseveres through difficulty. It bears all things, like a roof covering a house, protecting what is underneath. Love doesn't expose unnecessarily, but it protects and it restores. So when in your relationships, husband, wife, siblings, work, whatever, all many different relationships, do we assume the best or default to suspicion? And in conflict, do we keep score or do we extend forgiveness? You see, I reckon a lot of marriages would be really helped if no one kept score, but yet kept extending forgiveness time and time again. Not that we should be walking over anybody, that's completely not true, but forgiveness. And as a church, are we building people up or quietly pulling them down? I've heard a lot of preachers say this. Instead of the word love, insert your name. Rob is patient and kind. Rob doesn't envy or boast. Rob is not arrogant or rude. Rob doesn't insist on his own way. Rob's not irritable or resentful. Rob doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Rob bears all things. Rob believes all things. Rob hopes all things. Rob endures all things. Now, if you've done that to yourself, I've done it for Rob, right? The bits that don't feel true to you, those are the areas the Spirit still has work to do in you. The ones that feel, yeah, that's me, the Spirit's done its work there, so maintain that. But where it's like, it's not true, okay, they're the things that I need to work on. They're the things I need to surrender more to Jesus. They're the things I need the Holy Spirit to work more within me and ask Him to do that. Give Him permission, submit, listen, respond, obey. And then true love endures. Love never ends. Prophecies, they'll pass away. Tongues, they'll stop. Knowledge will pass away. For we know in part, we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child, reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see like in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. Paul lifts our eyes from the present to the future. He says love never ends. See, everything the Corinthians were obsessed with, tongues, prophecy, knowledge, they're all temporary, yet love is not. Gifts are for this age, love belongs for eternity. See, there will come a day when prophecy is no longer needed because we will hear God directly. A day when knowledge is no longer partial because we will know fully. A day when tongues cease because understanding will be complete, but love will remain. Paul gives two illustrations to make this clear. Childhood and adulthood is the first. See, children focus what's on immediate and temporary. In one sense, every child is selfish by nature because everything's about them and right now. As they grow older, that starts to change, right? But ultimately, children focus on what's immediate and temporary. Think of all the different fads that kids go through, right? I was trying to list some and I just got confused because it was too many and you don't know what Tarzos are, some of you. But that's not wrong, right? It's just immaturity. When maturity shifts attention to what truly lasts. The Corinthians were acting like spiritual children, fixated on gifts that were going to cease, ultimately, pass away. But Paul calls them to grow up by valuing what endures. And his second illustration is a mirror. In Paul's day, they didn't have mirrors like what we do. They were made out of metal. And Corinth was a famous producer of some of the finest bronze mirrors of antiquity. So they would hammer out flat sheets of bronze to try and get it as flat and as shiny as possible, so when you looked in the sheet of bronze, you saw your reflection. That was how mirrors worked back then. And it was not great. That's why Paul says you see dimly, because you couldn't see definition. There's the difference in one sense that you know, I'd almost imagine those who need glasses, right? You take them off, you're like, you put them on, you're like, right? It's a little bit like that, I'd say. You could see things, but not clearly. And it's almost like looking indirectly. And Paul says that's what it's like now, but we see partially, we see dimly, but then, when we're with Jesus, we'll see him face to face. Not a reflection, not a shadow, direct presence. It's like seeing the photo of someone versus standing in front of them. Right now we live by the photograph. One day we'll stand face to face with Christ. And in that moment, faith will give way to sight. Hope will be fulfilled, but love will only deepen. So now faith, hope, and love remain. But the greatest of these is love. Love is greatest because it not only lasts, but it grows into eternity. And so that's all great to know, but what difference does it make in us? How does this knowledge transform us? How do we listen to what God has been saying today and then obey him? Well, are we investing our lives in what will last beyond this life? Are we prioritizing love over being right impressive or recognized? And when we're serving Jesus, are we building something eternal or just something visible? Because one day, only one thing will matter. Did we love? At the end of the day, 1 Corinthians 13 is not primarily a wedding reading. It is a mirror held up to the church. It asks us, what kind of people are we becoming? What kind of community are we forming? What does our spiritual life actually look like? And ultimately, it points us to Christ. Because this is not just a description of love, it's a description of him. So Jesus is patient and kind. Jesus does not envy or boast. Jesus is not self-seeking. Jesus does not keep a record of wrongs. He cancels them at the cross. He bears, believes, hopes, and endures all the way to Calvary. And by his Spirit, that same love is being formed in us. So the call is simple, not easy, simple, to not just admire love, not just talk about love, but to live it. Surrender to God's love and live it. Because in the end, when everything else falls away, our gifts, our achievements, our recognition, only this will remain. Faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Let's pray. Gracious and loving Father, we thank you for gathering us as your people today. We thank you for your word, for the reminder that love